Epic fantasy literature is unrecommendable. At least a good chunk of it is. Now, I can hear many of you rushing to the comments already, but let me make my case first. I didn't say it was bad or that it wasn't worthwhile, just that it's unrecommendable. Think of it this way. One friend says to another, "Dude, you gotta try this series." The other person humors the recommender and gives the book a try, and then they stall out after a few pages, or maybe a couple chapters, saying, "I don't know, nothing really made sense and I couldn't get into it, so I just kinda gave up." It's a common conversation, and you've probably been on one side or the other at some point. For completely anecdotal, unscientific reasons, I'm convinced that this conversation is increasing in frequency. What I'm not convinced of is that this means fantasy needs to change. No, I quite like where fantasy is at as a genre. I think it's us, the fans, who need to change the way we talk about it and recommend it. But I'll get to that in a moment. First, let's talk history. The modern fantasy novel, as we know it at least, began with The Lord of the Rings. That story begins in the Shire with its lovable agrarian hobbits. Theirs is not a lifestyle that many people lead now, and already less and less so when The Fellowship of the Ring was published in 1954. But for Brits and most people in Western countries at the time, the Shire was instantly recognizable as the idealized world of their parents or grandparents. Same goes for the hobbits, too. And this will be vital as the story progresses, because as the story becomes stranger and older and grander and magic-ier, it's the hobbits who act as a sort of mental and emotional home base for the modern reader. It was an ingenious way for Tolkien to hold his readers' hands as he led them through his fantastical story. The world has changed pretty rapidly since 1954, though, and even though in cosmic terms the late 19th century that the hobbits inhabit isn't that far back, it nevertheless occupies the same intellectual space for most of us as the Norman Conquest or the Book of Exodus, and while some fantasy evolved with the passage of time, much of it didn't. So when we meet Shay Omsford in Shadyvale, or Garyon in Falder's Farm, or Randall Thor in Emmons Field, it's all instantly recognizable if you are already intimately familiar with the fantasy genre that Tolkien created. All these places may not exactly imitate the Shire, but they share that same kind of late 19th century as seen through imperfect glass feeling. So if you grew up on The Lord of the Rings, or if, like me, you had parents who nudged you down some other fantasy path as a kid, then these places feel familiar to you, sort of like they would have to those 1950s Brits. But now, it's in a more insular way. The genre has created its own in-group language or script, so that for these readers, stopping at the local inn for a pint of mead and a bit of town gossip after a hard day of working the forge feels comfortable and familiar, even though neither they nor anyone they know has ever experienced such a thing in their lives. But outside that in-group, the hobbits, or their equivalents, didn't quite work as well as they once did as a guide for later generations of the uninitiated. So it was time to update the idea, and some authors did just that. Terry Brooks's Landover series, for instance, follows the exploits of a Chicago lawyer of all things in a magic kingdom full of kobolds and wood nymphs. When the first Landover book was published in 1986, do you suppose a Scotch-drinking high-rise dweller would be a more recognizable guide to the land of faerie than a tiny bourgeois Victorian hobbit? Of course he would. Well, maybe not for a kid, but of course that brings us to the great success story of modern fantasy, Harry Potter. Think about it. While the Dursleys' home may not be the most pleasant place, it's certainly recognizable to kids today, and adults for that matter, who know what it's like to live in the suburbs, get teased at school, and watch parents go to work at boring jobs. Harry may have a high midichlorian count or whatever it is that makes him a wizard, but throughout the series, he talks and thinks and relates to his new life just like a normal kid, giving the reader something to cling to as normal, as he's led further into the weird, anything-goes wizarding world. Other stories go a different way. Some authors began throwing off the tired old cliches, but in many cases, rather than finding a different way to lead a reader through a story, they found ways to simply throw the reader into the story. The Name of the Wind, for instance, has a frame story set in a 19th century wayside inn, again, not very familiar for many people, but there is a more familiar home base for the reader in the form of the university, but we only get there after half the freaking book. Or consider many of the works of Brandon Sanderson, Mistborn, the Stormlight Archive. These books dispense with any sort of hand-holding and just chuck you into the deep end, hoping you can learn to swim before you give up and drown. And like I hinted at before, this is not necessarily a bad thing. If we go back to Tolkien, his entire reason for writing his mythology was to subcreate, to emulate God in his own small way by creating a secondary world where readers could have experiences, learn lessons, and return to our own world refreshed and perhaps even enlightened. But diving headfirst into a detailed and colorful secondary world is a tall order, and to make it easier for readers to accept all of this, he gave them the Hobbits as guides, and he was right to do so. But now, with the genre so firmly established, authors are freer to simply subcreate, to create those secondary worlds with their rich histories, characters, and systems of magic and politics. By bypassing the home base concept, these stories can be more immersive, more purely escapist, and thus better able to deliver those refreshing, enlightening, transformative experiences. While hobbits may have been a necessary addition to Middle-earth for Tolkien's 1950s audience, they were, throughout the story, strangers within it. The same cannot be said for Kaladin or Kelsier or Kvothe, and so they provide a more immersive and thus more potentially rewarding experience. Now, what's my point with all this? To a small degree, it's to point out to aspiring fantasy writers that they have a choice to make right up front which type of book they want to write and who they want to write it for. Is it a story for the newcomer? Is it meant to lead a child or a young adult by the hand on their first foray into fantasy? Or is it what we might call advanced fantasy, the purer type of escapist, transformative subcreation? Knowing that before you start will help focus your efforts in whichever direction you choose. But for the most part, my point is that the rest of us, the readers, the most ardent fans of the genre, can get a lot better at recommending fantasy to our family and friends. If your friend has never read a fantasy book in her life and you hand her The Way of Kings because it's your favorite book ever, yeah, you may get lucky and your friend will love it just as much as you do. Far more likely, though, is that your friend will quickly get lost, give up, and be left with the impression that, yep, it was true all along, all those nerds just have super weird taste. Conversion is rarely an immediate struck-by-lightning event, and initiating someone to fantasy is no different. If you want to argue that The Wheel of Time is superior to Magic Kingdom for Sale in artistic merit, I probably won't argue with you. But I will argue for the latter as the better introduction to fantasy every single time. The smart route for us fans to take is to find and recommend those introductory stories, the ones with a relatable and recognizable guide who can help new readers re-enchant their lives as they make their way, little by little, into the wild world of faerie.